The first concept, or the first geographical thing that we need to understand and we need to come to terms with, is the concept of desert. Now, the desert is really the pervading image that will be in the terms of Tanakh. It's in an area which has got very little rainfall, which has got very little vegetation, where water is a premium. And as such, desert becomes a very important aspect to understand the Tanakh. For us, where we live in an environment which is green and agricultural and receives lots of rain, we don't really get the concept of desert at all. But in fact, what we need to understand is that the desert within the Tanakh is contrasted with the garden. And of course, we read about the garden straight away, right from Genesis chapter 2 in the Garden of Eden. In fact, even Genesis chapter 1 with the creation of the world. Notice that in creation of the world, it's talking about vegetation and plants and animals, not so much about deserts. And so what we really realize is that right from the beginning of Tanakh, what we have is a contrast between what is of God's blessing, which is the garden, where there is development, where there is growth, where there is vegetation, and then the place of God's curse, which is the desert. And so the desert very much is a symbol of the lack of God's blessing. It's the lack of God's presence, because where God is, there is the garden. And where the God isn't, that's where there is desert. And so desert begins to take on, in a sense, the image of evil, of destruction, of separation from God. When Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they have to till the soil, and the soil doesn't produce any food. It doesn't produce the fertility that they had had in the garden, because now they were outside of God's blessing. And so we can see that there's a very close connection between desert and God's curse, and the garden and God's blessing. And so those images repeat themselves over and over within the prophets, within the Torah, where we actually have this concept of God's blessing versus God's curse. And the desert definitely has that concept of it. Another image, or another version of the desert, we sometimes actually call the wilderness. And so the wilderness that's where the evil resides. That's where the evil, the animals that would destroy your life, which would take your life, would come from the desert. And so the desert is very much a place of great imagery, of great connection. But it's also a place where it's a separation. It's a curse of God. So you're outside of God's connection. And so the images that the desert begins to pull up are images of purification. So people get sent into the desert for a time of purification, a time to, in a sense, get themselves right again, get themselves in order again. When after the exile, the Israelites leave Egypt and they go into the desert, and they wander around the desert for 40 years. They wander a desert, not a garden, because the desert is this place of purification. It's a place where we come again to terms with who we are. You'll see even in the New Testament, Paul tells us in Galatians that once he became a Christian, he went into the desert, into the Arabian Peninsula. With Jesus, after he is baptized in the Jordan, immediately it says that the angels then led him into the wilderness, or into the desert. In fact, even in Jewish feasts, or Israelite feasts, we get the feast which is called the Day of Atonement. And in the Day of Atonement, what they would do is take 2 goats. One goat they would sacrifice. The other goat would have the sins of the community, of the people, written on them and put onto his forehead. And then he is sent out into the desert as a sacrifice, as a means or a sense of, or a symbol of the purification that we would receive through the desert. So you can see that desert plays a huge role within the concept of both Tanakh and understanding Tanakh. So it has that image of separation from God, the image of the curse of God, and the image of purification. And that we are going to purify our relationship with God through the concept of the desert. So whenever you read the prophets, whenever you read the Torah, and you see that word desert, or you see the concept of wilderness, those are the images that need to come to mind for you. The concepts of looking at saying that God was going to separate them, was going to send them into the desert. Of course, the converse of that is true as well. We see that Joshua led the people out of the desert and into the promised land. As the Old Testament would tell us, or the Tanakh would tell us, it was the land flowing with milk and honey. It's, of course, the land which was seen to be a garden. So it's the movement from that into a time of garden. In the same way, in the New Testament, we have the concept of what Jesus does, leading people out of the wilderness of sin and into a new life in His presence. And so again, that concept of presence is there. It's very interesting to note that, in fact, one of the Arab words for garden is the word paradise. Now, that's an important concept, because what we realize is that Jesus on the cross, when He speaks to the one thief who's who's being crucified next to Him, He says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Notice He doesn't use the word heaven. He uses the word paradise, because the concept of paradise or the garden wasn't just a concept of heaven, somewhere removed in the presence of God, but rather it's a place where God was present. And so for the Jews, there was always a sense in which it was present here on earth, rather than being somehow translated to where God lives. God lives in heaven, but we can live in paradise, in the place here on earth, but in the presence of God. And so that's the difference. The desert is the place where God is absent. The garden or paradise is the place where God is present.